Morning, everyone. Thank you for making it out here nice and early for the very first session of the day. I hope everybody's been having a fantastic time at South by. Hopefully this will be a good, thought-provoking start to your day today. And as I usually like to do, before you get to know us, we'd like to get to know you. How many folks here are designers or workplace designers? Okay. How many folks here are work with your real estate, workplace services, facilities, some kind of team at your organization? Huh, there you go. Welcome. How many folks here are just curious because the title said brain health? Nice. Wonderful. Very good. I'm going to ask you to ask for a show of hands to 2 more questions. I know. You didn't sign up for this, but you get this. Can we have the next slide? How many of you felt like you multitasked this week? Did multiple things at the same time? Every single person in the room. Yeah. If we could put our legs up to be good. And then the next slide. How many of you did that multitasking from your desk? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. 6. Anybody else? All right. Well, congratulations, you hurt your brain. Can we go to the next slide here? That's probably one of the most famous desks in the world. That's the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, right? It was designed in the 19th century. That's not what our workstations look like, but the idea is kind of the same. And the idea actually was born around that time of a workstation. That idea that there's a surface at which we sit and do work has really had a hold on our imagination of the office, right? We've added other things to it, conference rooms and phone booths and whatever, but we think of a desk to sit at as our primary anchor in an office, right? But that's not meant to be. So we're going to talk about how actually that kind of workstation-centric office is actually not great for brain health, and what the problems there are. And to help us do that, we have a fantastic set of panelists here with us today. Starting from my right there is Case Lindbergh, who is a teaching professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. We also have with us Elizabeth Fallon, who's a studio practice leader for commercial interiors at HKS. And we have Tapi Sadiku, who is the strategic planning leader at the Heinz Craft Company. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. So we'll get started here with, a little bit of an introduction to the topic from Case and Liz. Go ahead, folks.
Great, thanks so much. We can go to the next slide after this, actually, too. So, and even one more. So what I want to do is just kind of quickly give some very high-level, very abstract ideas that are applicable for today's discussion that are grounded in what we know about brain health. So here you see a quote from the World Health Organization, which is defining brain health as a state of brain functioning across cognitive, sensory, social, emotional, behavioral, motor domains, allowing the person to realize their full potential regardless of the presence or absence of any kind of disorder or disease. And so there's a couple of key phrases in there that I think are really pertinent for today's discussion. One is realizing your full potential. There's a lot of different kinds of systems that are outlined there, but one that maybe we can all relate to right now are the different kinds of sensory profiles and sensory needs that we all kind of thrive under. So when you're hearing about different potential problems with all the various things we do at the workstation, think about what you would kind of want as your, best kind of place to focus. Is it a Starbucks? Is it a very, quiet place in a library stack, right? Everyone can identify that we have these sort of different needs or preferences for different tasks that we do throughout the day. And then the other thing there is about realizing our full potential regardless of the presence or absence of disease or disorder. So it's not about, do you have some sort of clinical disorder? Okay, then your brain is healthy. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about realizing your full potential based on all the things that we can hopefully unlock with a better functioning office. We can go to the next slide. And there's a bunch of things we could talk about with brain health, but three topics that I think are relevant today is that our brains are malleable, they're plastic. and they're really connected. So the more you have different areas of your brain connected, in many ways you have a healthier brain, a more efficient brain. Neuroscientists used to think that there were little bits and pieces of your brain, different areas of the brain that did very specific tasks all on their own. And it's just, we know it's not the case anymore. It's very connected. It's all about these connected networks. We also know that's measurable. So we're going to talk in a second about a study that I was involved with HKS and the Center for Brain Health at UT Dallas. And they have their own validated indices that measure brain health across all different kinds of domains, and we're going to talk about those in a second. And of course, you can imagine they have these indices, they have training. That means that they can track you over time, and it can be shown that your brain health in these different domains does improve and can improve over time. Three more boring academic points to make before we get into the good stuff. Strategic attention is one of those areas that the Center for Brain Health really wants to attack with their training. And this is the one of those three that's most important for what we're talking about today. So when you talk about strategic attention, we're talking about things related to not multitasking, to planning your day and having some really big tasks where you're really focused on that. You have other things you're going to get done, but you have a plan for what's meaningful to accomplish, and you're able to dedicate your brain's resources in a physical space, in a time designed to do that well, to your peak ability. Integrated reasoning is another domain. Here we're talking about things like having a new perspective, like zooming out, zooming in, not seeing different kinds of details if you're locked into one mode of thinking. And then innovation, we're talking about asking new questions like, what don't I know at all about this problem, or what's paradoxical? We had hoped in the study with HKS and the Center for Brain Health, there's a couple hundred participants spread out across a bunch of different HKS offices, all have sort of an open office. You have a workstation kind of setting. We hoped to attack all of these things. And again, these are just part of what makes a person's brain and life healthy. It's really hard, right? It's really hard to change entrenched behaviors in the workplace that you've been practicing for decades usually. You think you know what to expect your workday to look like, what your office is going to look like. So we really are just attacking that first one today, which is enough of a battle. So a couple quick stats from our study. So we saw that 6 out of 10 employees at HKS were dissatisfied with the lack of environmental control that they had. And we talked about multitasking. So managing distractions is a really hard part. I think everyone can kind of identify with that, but it's nice to also have some data to ground us in the sort of amounts of people that are saying that they have problems managing that and are multitasking. This is really washed out in the picture, but it's a nice plot because it shows you what kinds of activities people are saying they're doing throughout their workday at the office, and then on the bottom where they're doing those activities. So on the top you see all sorts of things. You can't read this, but stuff like individual focused work, collaborative work, having a virtual call, talking with people in person. And then you follow those ribbons of colors down, and you see that on the left, there's this huge chunk of over 70% of the time, people are doing all those tasks. You can see each one falling down to their workstation. So people are doing everything at their workstation, and then a smaller chunk of where they're doing tasks somewhere else. And we had 43% of employees say that they frequently multitask. There's a brain health cost to multitasking. There's sort of this badge of honor, I think, that we can probably all identify with either ourselves or a colleague that thinks they're really good at multitasking. Certainly that's a skill, but it always comes at a cost. It costs your brain stress and energy to switch between things. So even if you're really good at it, you're not being as efficient as you could if you were more strategically attentive to your task at hand throughout the workday. So we've already kind of stated the problem, but how do we use what we know about the brain, kind of based on the context so far, to activate this research in a workplace setting? And to do that, I want to show you a picture of this. So this is one of the brain's superpowers. All of your brains are doing it right now. You're seeing something, you're creating a concept immediately in your head, which is coffee cup, mug, something like that, but kind of without context right here, right? The other thing that your brain is doing as a superpower is predicting how you would use or interact with that object given how your body feels, given the context around it, and your learned history. So on a slide, it's just a coffee mug, right? But imagine it's in front of you, and then all of a sudden there's a spider walking across the floor. Well, all of a sudden, that coffee cup affords you some very different things. It affords you the ability to trap that spider, right? If you want to make noise, you can bang it. If you have a picture of something really meaningful on that mug, you can associate it with the prediction that you're having a routine in the morning and thinking about a loved one and feeling really relaxed or ready to go about your day. We're really, really good at abstracting different levels of these concepts, which are also predictions of how we interact with objects. That is one of our amazing superpowers, but they're not always positive things, right? And we're going to get to that in a second when it comes to the workstation. So I just said affordances a bunch of times. Everyone here is probably aware of the word affordance. It's been defined in various ways as we've thought about what it means to interact with different objects. But we know from a neuroscientific perspective recently that the idea that our brain is creating these concepts and predicting overlaps a lot with the idea of an affordance. So we might be kind of talking about the same thing with all these different words, and that's really exciting when things get more simple and when brain health and neuroscience becomes something that we can grasp and actually utilize in practice. So if that's one of the takeaways from what I'm talking about today, that would be wonderful. We see something, we're really good at abstracting different uses or interactions with those objects. That's a concept, that's a prediction, and it's often also an affordance. So given that context, we can now turn back to the workstation.
So what does all of this have to do with design and the workplace itself? I'll start by talking a little bit about kind of where the workstation came from, where it began. You know, ever since the workplace has evolved, ever since, you know, essentially the invention of knowledge work and post-industrial revolution, you know, private offices were the main kind of fundamental building block in most workplaces until around 1968, which is really in design history is when everything happened. The invention of the workstation came about. And since then, which you would think has been quite a good amount of time, we really haven't seen much innovation with respect to what the open office looks like and what a workstation looks like. Yes, there's cubicles and there's benching and there's different kinds of things, but really what you're seeing is, to Avi's point of his introduction, a flat surface through which we go to produce work, to get work done. So when you look at this picture, if you can picture kind of where maybe it's your workplace, maybe it's a workplace you've been to before if you don't have a physical office to go to any longer, but if you can imagine going to that desk and sitting down at that desk, what are the kinds of things you're doing? What are the kinds of work you're getting done at that desk? What was the reality of the kinds of work you were getting done at that desk? I think keep that in mind as we go through and talk a little bit about what we came to realize in the research. So in our work with the Center for Brain Health, we uncovered we really have 5 different affordances that we need to achieve at work. For years, I think we've talked a lot about focus and collaboration, but I think the others are just as important to our brain health in the workplace. So obviously we need to focus, we need to get stuff done. We need to get stuff done that requires our dedicated attention, as Case mentioned. We need to collaborate with others. I think the nature of work these days requires that we need to relate with others, work together, and actively collaborate. We need to ideate, which I think sometimes gets confused with collaboration. You know, yes, we ideate with others, but we also ideate ourselves, and it requires a different kind of flow that I think we'll talk about of thinking that requires different design needs in the spaces and the tools you're using. We need to come up with new ideas. We need to innovate. We need to think creatively, and that isn't necessarily, as we all know, the same thing as what we're doing when we're trying to focus. We need to socialize, which I think we all learned the hard way during the pandemic, right? This is a need for our brain health and our cognitive health to relate and connect to others, and we need to be able to do that in a physical office as well as remotely, and that requires different kinds of needs from a space. And we need to rest. You heard it here first, guys. You need to rest at work. It's not possible to be effective at whatever your job is, for however long you're doing it, if you do not rest in between. This is something that the center taught us fundamentally, and it's something that we know that our workplaces are trying to do through design, but are really not doing it as effectively. But, per our research as well, we are trying to do all 5 of these things at the desk at any given time. And what we're about to walk through is why that doesn't work. So the first is, we can't focus at the desk in an open office because we're constantly distracted. We're sitting next to others. We constantly need, headphones, noise canceling headphones, things to be able to focus because you're being distracted and constantly stimulated by those around you and the work and conversation going on next to you. We can't collaborate effectively. We're calling it lack of connectivity, but if you really think about, I'm a designer, if you think about how the workstation is designed and configured, it's really designed and configured as a command center. You're looking at monitors, you have your tools, you have your mouse, you have your keyboard, maybe you have your keyboard tray, your standing desk, all the kind of tools associated with that. That doesn't lend itself to collaborating with others. You can turn and collaborate and converse with the person next to you, but is that really the best physical design to, really give you that affordance at its highest level? We need to ideate, but ideating at the workstation, the workstation is really a fixed thing. There isn't a lot of means for kind of hacking that space. There's not a lot of ways of moving things around and creating different environments to be able to think creatively. Sometimes the space needs to respond in that way. It needs to be writable, hackable, movable, any of those things. The workstation's not good at that. We need to socialize, but again, that command center configuration is really, it lends itself to isolation. If you're at your desk, you're looking at a screen. You're not configured to talk to others. You're not gonna, if you want to talk to the person across the bench, you got to kind of get up and kind of go over the fence like Wilson from Home Improvement. It doesn't lend itself to that. And then lastly, I don't know if anyone tries to rest at their workstation. You're not resting. You might be scrolling, you might be checking email, but that's not rest, right? So we need to get away from that overstimulation in order to really effectively rest and find that rest at work. So the workstation's not doing any of these things well, but we're doing them all at the same time. And so what we really want to talk about today is, what are some ways that design can and should help encourage these affordances. And one of those ways is by breaking what we're saying, breaking the workstation, which we'll talk about in a second, but the ways in which the design can lend itself and encourage things like rest, things like focus, things like collaboration. We know ways that we can design spaces for that, but the workstation does none of them. And so how do we balance between kind of breaking our concept and our prediction of what we see and think when we see the workstation, what we know how to use it for when it's really not working effectively, and how we can design more effective spaces that can lend itself to all 5 of these things more effectively.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Liz and Case. That was amazing.
Oh, our call to action. I guess I can go through these too. And this is what we'll talk about in the panel now. I kind of alluded to this a little bit before. So, what we're asking everyone in this room to do is, really, we need to break our concept of the workstation. And that doesn't mean us as individuals, right? That means us as designers, as real estate professionals, as organizational leaders, as managers. We need to help our teams really think differently about how they use their space and how we design our spaces. I think as designers, one of my kind of calls to action is to really, how do we design workspaces without workstations? What does that look like? How traumatic would that be for people, but how effective would it be over time? We really need to help our people focus on matching the space to the work. I think that, especially post-pandemic, when we're in the office, there's still a high expectation that if you're not at your desk, you're not getting work done, and we really need to shift that. And we really need to help people feel empowered, and we need to provide spaces that empower people to move to the spaces that are more conducive to the work they're doing. So if they need to focus, they should go in a focus room. They can go in a focus room. If they need to collaborate, they should collaborate in a collaboration space, right? They shouldn't necessarily feel compelled to stay attached to that workstation, and we need to work together as designers and workplace professionals to really encourage that. Another big thing we talk about a lot in our work is we need to design time as well as space, right? We only have so much autonomy as designers to really provide, a workspace that gives you all the affordances we can. But if you and your organization are not helping your teams design the time to align that space to the work, then you're not really going to get the most out of the space, that investment, as well as the time of your team members. And then lastly, to reference Case's point about our superpower. We need to leverage our brain's superpower to predict through design, to lend itself to more effective uses of affordances. So how can we use design to signal rest in restful places? How can we use design to signal ideation in ideation spaces? And that's something that we're working on developing more, and we need partnership from organizations to really push that forward. So now I'm done.
My favorite stats that came out of the whole healthy workplaces movement, and if some of you may be familiar with the WELL standard, which certifies healthy workplaces, was that people put rest spaces and wellness rooms in their offices and had like an 8% utilization rate, right? So, it's like we've been talking about doing this stuff, but I think what we've missed is actually that spirit of action that you're talking about, Liz, is that we do have to match task to space, but we also have to train people to leverage their brains. We have to help people to do that, and I think we have to do that actively. So more to come on that, but Tapi, I want to bring you in here. As a leader in an organization and a manager, how do you see the impact of this research on brain health within your team or within your organization? How do you think it shifts the way you think about how we do work?
It's a nice, vague, and broad question, so I appreciate that. And I want to call out a few phrases you might. By the way, everyone, good morning, hello. I'm not American, as you can tell. I'm English. I live in Chicago. I married an American, so I'm an honorary American, not Australian, if anyone's curious about my accent. But Liz, I want to call out 3 phrases you've mentioned, because you said workstation, you said focus room, and then you said collaboration space. And I love station, room, and space. That's really how we think about it. So my team, before I took this position, I was actually our global head of employee digital experience. And that role was, I was reported to our CTO, looking at how we use technology and space, physical and virtual space, to enable people to achieve the promise of life, achieve the promise of work. And I loved that mission so much, because it was about enabling employees, focusing on our employees to achieve their purpose aligned to the company's purpose. And I just think it's so beautiful. I think in life, we are holistic beings, right? You're not like, the pandemic taught us we are not our home self, and then our work self, and then our social self. In fact, when you have to do everything in one room, you are just you. It's like, I am. It's so powerful. I really, really love it. Okay, so to answer your question, back probably in 2021, my team ran some ethnographical research. Now, you guys are designers, so I'm sure you understand what that means, but it's very new to me at the time. And what we did is we observed how our employees work, and we really watched them. And actually, in some cases, we had to watch them virtually, which was even more interesting, I thought, because I could see so much that I probably wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. And we would ask people, what does success look like in your day? And what was so interesting for me was that maybe I would ask the legal team, how do you define success? And they would say, enabling our company to be more effective when it comes to resolving resolving issues. And I just really loved the language that came out of it, because I was hearing legal talk about enabling, and maybe I was hearing marketing talk about something quite purpose-driven. And actually through that, we understood where people are today and where they want to be, and actually how do we help them get on that journey. And then we actually identified 3 modes of work, very similar to what your research pulled out. We spoke about focus time, collaboration time, and then time for creativity and innovation. And actually, they are very, very similar. We probably bucketed them in slightly different ways. But when it comes to focusing, who's ever been driving somewhere and you find yourself getting lost and you lower the music to see where you need to go? Because when we want to focus, we really need to limit and narrow distractions. We need to have a finite period of time to achieve a finite goal, and the tools have to enable us to do that. We then looked at collaboration, and Liz, as you mentioned, collaboration involves anything from partnering with one individual all the way to solving a wicked problem, or you're trying to think of the next best food innovation, let's say. We're really interested in looking at that convergence of food and technology. What does collaboration look like, and how do we design spaces to enable our employees to really be effective, whether it is an individual or 2-on-2 collaboration, asynchronous, all the way to solving a wicked problem, which maybe you want to do in person? And then how do we enable people to achieve the promise of life, feel creative and inspired, feel as though they are so productive that they have time to invest into the value add, and without even specifying exactly what should happen. Maybe we give the employee like an easel, a paintbrush, and we say, paint whatever you like. A picture of your dog, picture of yourself, maybe paint Picasso, be quite abstract. Paint your body, whatever, but here are the tools. And we kind of like bound innovation and creativity, which I really love. So the research lends itself quite nicely to the work that we did, because then we went to redesign our physical workspaces with the interest of, okay, this is the physical environment, but what does that look like replicated in a virtual space? Because obviously people at that time were not able to be in a physical office. In fact, we had all the social distancing, different issues in different states, in different countries across the world. And how do we enable our employees to be effective in person and virtually? Really like breaking that relationship with the desk, because actually it didn't exist, it wasn't there, so we had to really rethink. So those are some of the ideas I had, and I've really enjoyed it so far.
Yeah, I think that your specific experience in layering digital experience and the physical space make this a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure we're going to explore more of that. I think also what I hear in what you're saying, and I'm sure you all feel this instinctively, is the difference between the early days of the workstation in the 60s, right, is, the lead up to that came out of, time motion studies and kind of organizational efficiency. It's all focused on how does the organization get to its goals, and the employees are means to get there. But what you're saying is actually a negotiation or a convergence of organizational goals, group goals, and personal goals, right? And how do all three of those manage to coexist, and how do we create an environment for that? And I think that's a fundamentally different stance on what the purpose of the space where we do work is, right? And I think that's at the sort of foundation of this revolution. It's what makes this work on brain health, I think, possible. I have a couple more questions for our panelists here, but for everybody who's in the room, thank you, by the way, for joining us. We are going to start taking your questions, comments, responses, provocations, disagreements very soon. We just ask that you step up to the mic right here and give them to us. I speak for my panelists here to say that they love to be challenged. So let's have a vibrant dialogue. We're not just here to answer questions, but also, just bring a thought to the mic and let's ruminate on it together, okay? So we'll come to that in just a few minutes. I just want to dig in a little bit deeper into some of the stuff. So I'm sure this is something everybody's thinking about because, Case, you mentioned, we get the first part. I think we understand of the three parts that you mentioned, right? We understand that the space has an impact on brain health, right? And that the brain is plastic, that we can, improve it, change it. That's our hope. That's why we're all here. Most folks are here because they're interested in brain health. But I want to ask about that second part. How do we measure the health of our employees, brain health included, or the health of a workforce? And Toby started us off talking about that ethnographic study that they did. So let's just dive into that a little bit more. How do we make sure that we're on the right track? How do we guide our decision making for brain healthy workplaces?
Yeah, I can start. So through our work with HKS and the Center for Brain Health, they were grappling with this exact question. So they have this whole structure of how to train, how to measure your brain health just sort of in a vacuum, right? I mean, they realize that you're living your life. They have all these sorts of activities you're supposed to do and keep track of and train. But they didn't have anything specific to the workplace setting. So what we had to do, and we're still in the middle of right now, for all transparency, is to take those big buckets and see, okay, how do those actually apply to behaviors that you could observe in a workplace? Is that something where you are looking at and tracking where people are in time? Are you asking where they are in time? Are you tracking whether they're doing behaviors that are meant to be collaborative in spaces that are supposed to be for collaboration? Are you tracking where they're doing focus work when they say they're doing focused work, where they're saying and when they're saying they're doing focused work? So that kind of data is very much on the table to study just behaviors, because again, it's not just one person. It takes this whole office or groups of people to align in their behaviors. But you also have to ask people questions about how they feel, about their social connectedness, for how healthy they are outside of their life and in the office. Do they have positive social connections to their team? Do they have a best friend at the office? Do they have a healthy social life outside of the office? And you also have to ask them about their emotions. There's lots of things that we still have to ask people specifically to get insight into your own brain rather than just assuming it from some sort of thing that we can observe with an imaging tool or watching you move around space. So it's really about these sort of different layers of data collection and understanding the value of these different survey items, which are often discounted but still so important when you're talking about the brain.
May I add? I really love that you said the behaviors, and then you also mentioned what I'd hear is perception is reality, because the reality is right now, unless we're able, and I don't think we're actually able to add nodes to somebody's brain and track the behavior, right now we have to ask, like, how do you feel? And you're actually able to quantify like how people perceive they feel, even if it's after the fact. Like, how do you remember that you felt? And we run something called our IT happiness survey. It's got a very basic name, but we really ask people, do you feel as though you have the tools to be effective in the job, to be effective in your job? Because the reality is we never launch anything, whether it be a piece of technology or a physical space that does not technically work. You wouldn't launch it. So technically it does work. But the reality is it's just as good as a great meal. If nobody eats it, then it was just a dream. So you have to ask, did this taste nice? Did it actually satisfy you? Would you want to eat it again? How would you feel you'd like to see this improved? Did we get the time we served this well? And those are some of the questions, in regards to a meal. But there are some questions you can ask people about how they felt, because the reality is perception is reality. I'm sure everybody in the room, you probably don't even dress yourself if your clothes had holes in. So technically your clothes work, but how did it present? How did it show up in the world? So I really love the one about feelings. And then the behaviors piece. We can also look at data which says, okay, how many people are in meetings? If we run this type of different intervention, can we see a change in the number of people who are in meetings? Can we see the change in any network analysis? There's a ton of data that just exists there that is like neutral for employees, but on a population, we can see the impact of interventions. So it does require you to be quite creative, I would say, and actually lean into like a number of different things, so you can have like quantifiable data about number of meetings, how many people, qualitative data, ethnographical research, and together create that pool where you can really tell an impactful story. And then tell people, like tell your employees, hey, we ran this, maybe not use the word of intervention, but we ran this activity, and this is what we've seen, and we'd love to hear more from you, because actually it has to be this continual cycle. Some of the things that we did in 2021 were revolutionary in the space that I operate in, but 2024 they're probably just like threshold competencies. They're not as impressive anymore. So you have to continue to kind of solicit feedback from employees. Oh yeah.
Let's talk about maybe some early applications of this kind of thinking. Liz, are there any ways that it's starting to influence your work as an interior designer? Even if we're not seeing, built projects at this point, does it influence your process, the way you approach how you design a workplace?
Yes, 1,000%. I'm so glad you put it that way too, because I think in this industry, a lot of people think, well, there's the research, where's the build project that proves it out, right? Like, where's the workstation-less office? And there are companies that are doing radical things like that. There'll always be somebody doing something right at the beginning of the bell curve. But I think largely this is in the state of influencing process, to your point. It's helping us really rethink programming and how we work with clients to understand what their needs are. I think one of the things that, in Case and my work together, talking about this concept of metrics that matter, we just talked a lot about a lot of different metrics that we layer together to measure brain health, but just thinking about the metrics that matter and thinking in understanding which workplaces are most effective. And in my industry, benchmarking was the thing for many years of, there would be reports and reports put out of, what companies are running as far as square foot per person, collaboration seats to focus seats, things like that. All of that has really been thrown out the window, to be honest, post-pandemic. You cannot necessarily apply a number to a person because we don't know who's in, who's out, what kind of work the organization is doing. So what it's really doing is pushing us to really get kind of in the weeds with our clients very early to really understand our clients' work, become a student of our clients' work and our clients' business. And, we sort of put on our hats of whatever our client does. We learn what their work is, what their needs are, and then we develop programming for spaces based on that work. A lot of the time, and most of our clients, I will say, and I would argue most clients who are in the industry right now who are making workplace decisions are still coming at it with, well, I have 1,000 FTEs, I need 60% utilization, give me a floor plan with, 600 workstations. And, we're obviously still doing that work, but we come to the table with, ideas around how do we leverage the remaining space, how do we push them a little further? Maybe you really don't need 600, maybe you need 400, maybe you need 200. So we're working in a state of, we're at the very beginning of an evolution, a revolution, if you will, of, my dream someday is that there will be a workstation-less office, because I don't think it's effective, but I think we are a long way away from that because we're trying to turn the ship that's been established for, I'm not going to do the math right, 80 years, right? So it's definitely affecting process. It's affecting how we work with our clients, how we engage with them early. And I think there are many clients who are really savvy who know we need to do something different. They're not quite sure what that is yet. And the ones that kind of come to the table early and ask for different thinking out of the gate are the ones that'll be ahead of the game moving forward. But I would say the majority of the bell curve is really still in that, well, I need a certain number of desks because I need to justify this real estate investment, right? So we're very much still in that phase, but we're at the beginning of something very interesting, I think.
I could add on to that too. This might come up later, but it fits right now, which is this idea that if you have a client, even if it's an internal client, right, within HKS looking at their own real estate offices, and you have these conversations and you say, we need to do these things for a brain healthy workspace, and we say, we need to break this idea of the workstation. There still tends to be a compromise at the end of the day, right? So instead of having 80% of your FTEs having a workstation, a dedicated workstation where everybody knows, oh, I know where to go, I can predict exactly where I go to work that day, that's where I sit down and do my default everything, right? To get away from that, we can't just have maybe half of those workstations. And that's what kind of often happens as a compromise when you have these conversations and then you reach something at the end. We're like, okay, we can wrap our head around some of the workstations, but we still need some. And so when you have some of the workstations, then they become this hot commodity. And they're still seen as something that's like, if I can't get in early enough to get that workstation, then I'm not going to come in today. Which is exactly the problem that we're trying to break. Now it's like an even harder concept to break.
Yeah.
So there's probably a bunch of different ways to break that concept, but Liz was saying just getting rid of it is one way, right? Then you have to think about where am I going to do X task at Y time today throughout my day. We're not saying that's easy. It's really hard. It's going to be, have obstacles of decades of learned behaviors for what the workstation used to represent that's no longer there. But it's a real opportunity to see the office in a new light. Neuroscientists will call this experiential blindness. And experiential blindness happens. It happens to us all the time when we're traveling in a new country, you're going through immigration, or you're going through customs. You have to navigate something that you don't understand at all, right? Then you learn it, then you understand it, then you can predict how you interact with that thing in the future. In a workstation, or not in a workstation, but in an office, if you come and you don't see a workstation, you're having some form of experiential blindness the first few times that happens. You have to learn what your behaviors are in that space. Then you learn it over time, other people do it at the same time, and then you're kind of on a good road. I don't know that we've seen that been done successfully yet, but we're starting to see some of the obstacles of why it's hard to break something that's so multi-tentacled. The affordances of the workstation are untenable. That's why we need to break it. It doesn't mean that the ideal solution down the road for some company has a bunch of things that look like workstations, but the behaviors that are assumed there that every employee predicts you would do at those spaces are in accordance with other affordances that can live in that space. So that you have, layers of affordances that make sense to happen together, or activities that make sense to happen together.
There's a reason we use kicking the habit as the title of this talk. Like it's very much related to what I would imagine like addiction. Like, are we trying to cold turkey? Like, are we just going to get rid of them all and then see what happens? Like, that would chaos would ensue, right? So, but it's an option. But what are the other options? And I think the most realistic, and the one we're working through now, is trying to work incrementally and trying to work through compromise and help manage the challenge and stress that brings to an organization, because it's a completely, we've been through so much change. Everyone has been through so much change, especially in the workplace industry in the last 4 or 5 years. We're asking for more. That's a lot. That's a lot to put on everyone's plate. And so we understand that this is a big thing to ask and that it causes a lot of challenge and a lot of stress, but it's stress that in the end, I think, will lead to more effective people and more effective workplaces.
I know we're confusing. Mad. This is my final thing. Have you mentioned about the fact earlier in your introduction that we need to teach people the alternative? And in any case, even in the case of, going cold turkey, there's an alternative. If you did something one way, there is always another option. I just don't think in my experience, in my human experience today and my observation of others, I haven't yet seen very effective when you say, stop, this thing does not exist, and go forth and figure it out. It's whether we're prescriptive or we inspire through principles or we demonstrate alternatives, there needs to be an alternative. So I really just want to make sure that piece is coming out here. I think the workstation is something to rethink. As I sit here today, I wonder. So I work from home some days. I have an office. I don't even use our office. I prefer to sit at the breakfast bar because I like the light there. I like to be able to move around. The reality is when you need to do certain types of work, you need to be able to be stationary. So it's less about, as designers, you think of design thinking. It's less about the chair and more about the purpose. What are we here to do? Okay, maybe I need to rest. Maybe I need to sit. Maybe I need to socialize. But you're not so prescriptive about what that exactly looks like. So I like that design thinking process to kind of really understand the root cause, but then also suggest an alternative as well.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you came. I was going to come to you anyway, so I'm glad you came in on that. We're going to open up for your comments or questions. So anybody feeling inspired to come to the mic, this is the time to do it. Royce is going to come up, but while Royce is preparing her question, I'll just say one thing. One of the failures, and I'm sure y'all have, every few years there's a whole bunch of articles about how design thinking is really not all that it was meant to be. One of the failures of design thinking, I think I hear you all guarding against that failure actually in your comments, is that who decides what the activity is, right? So we know it's not about the chair, it's about sitting, but who decided that the person needs to sit? Right? And so there's all these layers, which is why, Tapi, your very first comment about, that conversation with individuals and teams as an organization is so important. You are defining the goals together rather than having a kind of top-down or prescriptive model. And I think that's, again, I see an implicit, assumption of that being a brain-healthy thing to do. And I just wanted to emphasize that for the group, right? That we're talking a little bit, we're actually, taking that to the next level. Absolutely.
And Case, as you mentioned, the brain is malleable. So is the objective and the goal.
Yeah.
It's all very possible to change. I love to use examples of stories because it helps me get my point across. And I think, imagine if you saw somebody who they have the physique of someone who would be an awesome swimmer. Maybe they're really tall, they've got broad shoulders, maybe they have webbed fingers, webbed toes, but they live a very unhealthy lifestyle. To tell them today, you will be an Olympic swimmer could be so bizarre, but maybe you would start with, okay, we walk around the block, and then we extend that to maybe a mile, then we extend it to 2 miles, 3, then maybe we look at fitness, maybe we look at muscle gain, maybe we look at fat loss. There's the different stages, and actually as you go through those stages, you may also say, we really thought you would be an awesome swimmer, but the reality is actually you would make a great diver. Maybe it's changed. And I think there's got to be the grace that, yes, as the brain is also malleable, so is the objective, so is the purpose. And I really love how you can apply Agile as a methodology to kind of look in small increments when it comes to achieving goals.
Absolutely.
Sorry. I just want to add quickly too, and that relates to physical design too. I think we're trying to rethink how we think physical spaces. Physical spaces can change, they can evolve, they can be in trial, and I think that we're trying to push that as well. That encouraging that flexibility. So.
Absolutely.
Are you finding that the furniture manufacturers in our industry, like Miller Knoll and Steelcase and Technion and Hayworth and all that, are in alignment with some of this thinking? Obviously, they sell workstations, so how do you bring them along with these ideas? Because, do they have to design differently, design different kinds of furniture? What happens to the workstation?
That's a great question, and I think one of my next steps is to really start to partner with them to understand this research and what does that mean for the furniture systems industry. I think the workstation as a module is a foundational element of the workplace, and it's a foundational element of that industry. But I also believe there's so much opportunity here to really come up with and bring to market new and revolutionary product. Because I would also say that I think there's been some really interesting pieces that have come out in the market in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, but it is really all, I think, derivative of the same thing. It's kind of been incremental, which, again, we're trying to change, we're making generational change in this space, so that makes perfect sense. I think it's a real opportunity to partner with designers, neuroscientists, researchers, to really rethink what are the ways that we can push forward systems furniture design, because I do think there's a lot of change to be made, but we have not yet made those connections, but that's definitely, I think, an important step for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, and I think most designers would relish the opportunity to create something new. But I also think there's a lot that already exists in catalogs that can be arranged in different ways to signal different things for our brains. So we mentioned before, I think Liz, you were mentioning before about how can we signal this, and I've heard you talk about shortcuts in the office, providing different things, right, the paintbrushes and things. So when you enter a space, even if you're not trained in that office space, if you enter a space for the first time, we all have predictions on how to use it, right? Everybody came into this room and knew how to find a seat, and they knew they were going to be up here, right? It didn't take any mental energy at all. So when you're in a library and you walk into a space that looks and feels, because of the tones and because of the materiality and behaviors and the arrangement of furniture, looks quiet, you know to behave sort of in a quiet way. So it's an exciting opportunity to say what that already exists in your designer's catalog can we arrange in different ways so it pushes people apart, so it brings people together, so it signals calm, so it signals activity. And a lot of our modern offices kind of feel the same, right? Unless there might be some slight arrangements, and this is a chair versus a workstation, but there's a lot more we can do with the existing parts and pieces.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Great, and I have one more question. Liz, you mentioned generational change, and you're hoping that this will become that. But what about all the different generations in the workplace today? I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up in sort of the old school office and design firm experience where if I'm not at my desk, I'm being seen as unproductive. And I even have that philosophy now that I work from home full time. I eat breakfast at my desk, I eat lunch at my desk. I eat lunch in 5 minutes, and I'm like, I'm working from home. Why am I eating at my desk? This is silly. But it's conditioned, right? So how do we help older generations like me, and then even young youth generations who don't even have that conditioning, really understand this new way of working?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and a great question, and one we are trying to figure out live, I think. So I'm an architect and interior designer, but I've also spent the last 8 years studying flexible work, which came in very handy in 2020. And I think one of the biggest things that has come out of the pandemic is really understanding that we've gone through so much change, and we've asked everyone to change very quickly. And I think that we have not necessarily given enough empathy or compassion to the older generations in the workplace. We're asking them to completely throw out the baby with the bathwater about how they've developed to work, no matter where the space is or what the space is. We're changing how they fundamentally work, manage, mentor, teach, all of that. So I don't think there is a good answer yet. I think that we're really trying to figure out how to leverage the most out of everyone and give empathy and compassion to everyone. And so much of it is the people work. So much of it is the people work and the process work and the policy and the training and the kind of connectivity, human relational connectivity part, that the design can only do so much. So I don't think we have the answer yet to that, but I think it's something that the pandemic has really brought to the surface, and it's made it feel very acute, and that we know it's a problem now. So we have awareness, and we're moving, I think, from awareness into action, but I don't think we have the answer yet.
May I add?
Please.
I watched this TED Talk, I think it must have been 2018, so even before the pandemic, and it spoke about digital natives and digital immigrants. In those days, I was really trying to understand, what does this digital nomad, I guess wasn't really a phrase, but digital native and digital immigrant, really what did that mean? And what the TED Talk was saying, and actually maybe if you just Google digital natives and digital immigrants TED Talk, it will come up because it was in the title. It was talking about the fact that if you think of someone who is native, it is like in them, they are of the place. If you think of someone who is an immigrant, they are coming to the place. So even me, I'm an immigrant to the United States. I'm actually also an immigrant to Austin. For those of us who don't live here, we are immigrants here, and there are natives here as well. And at some point, if I stayed long enough, I switched from being an immigrant to being a native, because I really understand it. And there's something to be learned, regardless of I kind of want to take age out of it, but let's talk about tenure, because you can be relatively new to the workforce but have greater tenure in an organization than someone who is maybe older in age than you but newer to that particular organization. But there's things to be learned, and I kind of see it as this like beautiful, like harmonious relationship where you, again, collaborate to understand like what is the best to learn from both. There's an organization I'm heavily involved with in Chicago, which I think is phenomenal. It's called Chicago Innovation. And they have something called Ageless Innovators, where they aim to do the same. So they look at tenure and they say, you have been in a particular space longer than someone who's relatively new. And that might be somebody who even wants to understand about social media. You can have that reverse mentoring relationship. And that gives you the grace to kind of take the best from both and then collaborate and create something new together that honors both positions that both people come from. That sounds quite airy, but it is very possible to do. So I really strongly recommend that TED Talk, that Digital Natives and Digital Immigrants TED Talks. It was awesome. And I don't know where you're based, but also just look at the stuff that Chicago Innovation are doing. It's Chicago based, but they are like nationally known. And I think they are truly phenomenal.
I just quickly want to say I love the idea of taking an age dynamic out of mentorship. And I think that's actually a really powerful idea. But that's a whole other panel, folks. We'll come back to here with that next year. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious. We have a hybrid work environment and 3 physical offices, one that's fully remote. Each of the physical offices about 30,000 square feet. And I was we're also very tech heavy. People have 2 computer towers. They have 2 monitors. We have dev kits. We have a lot of different things. We just recently completed a build out. We're finishing one in May. I do believe in giving people autonomy. They have 24 pop funk figurines on their desk and 5 photos of their kids or whatever they're into, right? But do you have any just more tactical, practical, logistical tips? I mean, we have the collaboration spaces, we have phone rooms, we have a wellness room. I recently did have to remind someone to use that. We have, we have a large gathering space, and we do believe the magic doesn't always happen at your desk, that we consciously want to create spaces. But do you have just any kind of tactical things we can actually do soon?
Yeah. Sure. So can I ask, you said the work's tech heavy, so is the majority of the work like heads down focus work, or is there a mix of collaboration?
There's a mix of collaboration.
Okay.
Yes, we develop video games, so there is
Okay,
collaboration amongst disciplines, and then there are times where you are just heads down.
Sure.
Now I'm implementing what we've decided on.
Yeah. I mean, I think the fastest thing, or the quickest thing that comes to mind for me, is really having leadership embody the behavior and demonstrate the behavior live. So if you've got managers of teams who are at their desk and collaborating at their desk and ideating at their desk, their teams are going to do the same thing, right? If you have a manager who's really like, okay, we're going to do a scrum and we're going to meet in this space and we're going to work all day in this space, like bring your laptop, or bring your iPad, and we're gonna disconnect and we're gonna do this. I think it's really on either like top, executive leadership or even I think middle management. I think there's a lot of opportunity with encouraging middle management to model the behavior and to use those spaces more, and that will signal to everyone else it's okay. But I think to your point, if the work is tech heavy, there's always going to be that pull. There's always going to be that pull back, because it's their station, it's assigned to them, it's where they get their work done. So I think the easiest thing would really be to have middle management model that behavior and ask them to really engage in other spaces more often.
Thank you. As I was listening to you, I was trying to imagine what your space looks like. And actually, Liz, I'm very glad that you asked, like, what type of work, because my question was going to be what industry are you in, without you having to maybe disclose the company you work for. So I don't know if you know of Andrew Huberman. He's a neuroscience professor at Stanford University, and he has a ton of research where he talks about, like, when you need to focus, you kind of need to put like your blinkers on. Like, when you have like a horse, I don't have a horse, but if you see a horse walking down the street, it has like the blinkers on. And you can cocoon yourself. He even talks about, like, with students when they wear a cap and when they need to focus on like an assignment, they really get into their workspace. So taking on some of that research, when we were designing our physical, like, individual spaces, we don't have assigned seating, so I love the fact that you're able to kind of be creative in your space because we have a clean desk policy. But our space almost has like a curved computer, has a curved monitor. I think it's almost like a 38-inch monitor. It's maybe not 38, anyway, it's huge. And it's the equivalent of having two monitors next to one another, but it almost creates that cocoon feel. And there's a ton of stuff you can do with like that, creating that cocoon feel when it comes to like that focused deep work. Even with when it comes to lights, typically when you need to focus, it shouldn't necessarily be such a very bright type of room, like using darker colors. Even when it comes to like the technical side, you can even put like a darker mode on it. Like Andrew Huberman, in fact, he actually has a podcast on this. His podcasts are quite long. He has a podcast called The Huberman Lab. I strongly recommend everybody in this room subscribes, because it's awesome and it's free and it's scientifically based, and he brings in a ton of different researchers and a ton of different like people in the field. But he has a specific episode where he talks about focus and deep work, and I just remember walking around like making so many notes, like, okay, there's so many quick interventions you can do that are relatively cheap, like darker rooms, not that expensive to do. I mean, that's when it comes to like focus. And then he has some incremental additional interventions that you can run when it comes to creativity. This would be somewhere that you really wouldn't want to have a workspace where people can come together. They can, like, I don't know if you have a culture where people draw a lot. Maybe you want to like draw on walls. That's something that we brought into our workplace. Or if you want to have like a physical, like a whiteboard, that can also be replicated in like a technical sphere. So if somebody is not in the room with you, they can also collaborate. There's just tons, and they're so relatively cheap. And I'm a big believer in like proof concepts, like something you can test quickly, see if it works in your environment. I do think it's very important to honor the family. And some people don't really like work to be described as a family. Maybe I'm even more like that as well, but just taking out of it, there's like nuances in different groups or different families. It's very important to like honor the nuances. If your family eat meals together, don't try and make people eat separately. If there's a culture where people eat separately, but they come together for a stand-up, honor that culture as well. But sincerely, that Huberman podcast is really, really good.
Thank you. We say friends because you're allowed to have boundaries with your friends.
I like that.
Yeah, I'm the co-CEO, and my co-CEO, we purposely go eat lunch in the lunchroom so people feel that permission. So thank you for all these tips.
That's great. I love that. We're actually almost at time. Do we have time for one last question, you think? One last question.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're going to make our responses quick.
Maybe just more of a thought provoker anyways. Okay, the workstation. If you took a carbon calculator to the furniture in an office, the workstation, way up there, the number one thing that has that carbon, right? It's the number one carbon footprint of an office. So if we could marry this concept of getting rid of the workstation with dematerializing the office and reducing the carbon footprint of an office, we would have something, right?
Amen. I mean, I love that. I think that's amazing. That connection hadn't been made in my head before, but you're absolutely right. I think we think about it a lot from a real estate, like, square footage and cost for, workplaces. Like maybe you don't need as much space. It doesn't always work out that way. But yes, absolutely. I love that. What a great additional argument to make for this.
Can I make one quick point? Really quickly, there are people who are looking at that. There's LEED, L-E-E-D, there's a certification you can get, and come to me afterwards, I'll remember the name of the second company that like literally are measuring the impact of removing and adding things to the workspace.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you about that.
This is a pet topic of mine, so I can't stay quiet. I'll just say for anybody who's making decisions at your company around workplaces, your workplace is the carbon bomb that nobody's paying attention to. Everybody's looking at your utility bills and your operations. Metropolis, our magazine, was the first to publish the research that said that, renovations of interiors are actually about 50% of a building's material carbon emissions. We call them embodied carbon emissions. And so there's a huge, huge benefit to company ESG goals, to your climate commitments. If any of you are climate pledge signees, there's a huge, huge benefit to trying to dematerialize the office. If most of you probably do business in California, if that bill finally gets into implementation, it's been already passed. If your company needs to start reporting Scope 3 emissions, you're going to want to get rid of those workstations pretty quick. So we'll get there. That's actually a great note to end this conversation on. Once we start to question the fundamental assumptions of how we do work, I think new possibilities open up. And that's the spirit that I would love for everyone to take away from here. We have to liberate our own brains from the affordances we've set up for how organizations work, how spaces work, how people work together, and we'll all emerge healthier. So thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us today. I hope this has been a great session for you. Thank you to our fantastic panelists as well.